In this video, I follow along as Peter Polcyn of Rail & Stile Custom Woodworks builds a new shop cut table to replace his original prototype, an upgrade that will bring better stability and more functionality to his already awesome design. Let's have a look.
So this is my dedicated cut table that I designed about a year ago. I needed something flat with lots of support for using a track saw. Don't want binding or anything like that, so I came up with the torsion box system. This is all 3/4 plywood. I found that it did sag a little bit in the middle here. There's a rack here that holds the tracks, and I had this as a separate piece here. So in the next version, this is all going to be one piece, a full 12 inches. I'll give it a lot more support over the length of the table. Having dust not collect on the surface was an issue for me. I wanted it to go away. So having it open to the floor worked out in the beginning, but I just find that having dust build up under the table all the time is kind of a problem. So I'm going to do a pan that starts in the center and goes to each end and will be sloped towards the floor, and then have a box at the bottom where it can pull out and empty the dust that collects. And then change the leg design a little bit and make this leg and this support all integral and in plywood. So another feature of this is if you're cutting smaller stuff and you want to clamp it down, it's easy enough to just hook underneath here and clamp wherever you need to. That was another reason I didn't want a solid top, was the ability to clamp wherever you wanted to. And dog holes and stuff are nice, but they still don't have enough of an opening to allow the dust to fall. It's worked out really good for the past year, so I keep two different saws on it. I have a cordless one. This one generally, this Makita I use for the cross cutting, and then the Festool I use for the ripping and thicker materials, like 8/4 or what have you, solid lumber.
Before ripping the parts for the tabletop grid, Peter lines up the 3 sheets of 3/4 inch Baltic birch he'll use to make the table, and uses a track saw to cut a clean, uniform edge to work from. Then he moves to the table saw to rip the 4-inch members that will make up the torsion box grid. For now, he keeps everything at the 8-foot length, as he'll bisect and trim boards later in the process. Once cut, he stacks the pieces on end on top of 4 evenly spaced clamps, then squares up the ends and uses coals at each clamp point to crank the pieces into a uniform sandwich before tightening the clamps. This is a key step to ensure the dados will line up and be uniform. For layout, he starts with a center mark so he can work in each direction rather than starting on one end and telegraphing any inconsistencies across the entire stack. Then he sets a digital caliper to half the width of the dados and makes a mark. This gives him the outside edge of the first center dado, which he'll reference to lay out the rest. For this step, he cuts 2 blocks that represent the inner and outer position of each corresponding dado. Here the plywood cutoff represents the dado.
This is the thickness in between, so I can just set it on that line. Then I take a knife and then I'll scribe the other side of it. So that's the space in between each one. Then I can use this and put it on the line, and that gives me the other side.
Once it's all laid out, he follows up with a pencil for a good visual reference. Then he bisects the board, marking the depth of the dado.
We've already found the depth of our cut, so now we're going to set the saw to that depth, or a little bit less. We don't want to take the full depth with the saw. We want to come back with the router and clean it up to the exact depth. So I'm just going to set the depth here.
He cuts the dados with multiple passes, and to move with ease and accuracy, cutting right up to and in between the lines, he uses a guide rail square attached to the track.
Just slides on, and it locks on, provides a real nice positive lock and perfect square from this face to this face and this face to this face.
Once all the cuts are made, he follows up with a mallet and chisel to break out the bulk of material. Then he fabricates a router jig for the final pass.
So when the router rides in here, when it rides against this fence, it's cutting exactly this side of this. So this inside edge here is exactly where the router will cut. And the same on this side. When it goes to this side, it's cutting exactly this inside edge.
Before using it, he squares it up and installs guide blocks to the underside. Then he double checks the depth and sets the router bit before routing out the base of each dado. I thought the jig was pretty slick and wondered why he didn't use it to bore out the entire thing.
So I've tried just routing the dados before in plywood, and I've always seemed to have some issues with it, either wanting to pull the bit out. Since I'm using a spiral upcut bit, get too much load on it, it wants to pull that bit out. Other thing is if you try to cut too much or something, it might jerk and it might mess up your jig. So I like to just eliminate that option and just hog out all the material first with the saw, and then just come back and just make a light pass to clean it up. Now we're going to cut these in half. These will be our cross pieces.
He cuts to either side of the center dado, leaving 2 flush ends. He cuts 2 stacks of 4, leaving them with 16 cross members, but the table only needs 15, leaving 1 extra. To assemble the grid, he lays out and dry fits a few parts to ensure he's got it right. Once satisfied, he adds a dab of glue to each connection point, then fits the parts together, driving them home with a rubber persuader. As the assembly progresses, he adds clamps at regular intervals to keep the joints tight while the glue sets up. And just like every other large glue-up I've witnessed, it doesn't take long before every clamp in the shop is being used. While that sets up, Peter rips the 12-inch perimeter boards, then breaks out his track saw to clean up and trim the edges of the grid before installing them.
So I wanted to straight line it and then make it so that the outside of the table will be 48 inches because my ends are only 48. That way the ends will cover the sides. Just gonna do the same on the other side. And then I'll do the ends. Those I'm just gonna straight line. Then we'll flip it over, finish the rest of the cuts, and put the sides on it.
Peter tacks the perimeter in place and drills pilot holes before fastening with screws. He installs them at least an inch below the tabletop to avoid cutting into them later when the table is in use. Next he moves on to the legs, which are made from the same Baltic birch plywood. Then he installs the storage shelves on each end of the table, screwing them in place and adding a lip to the edge. Before bracing the shelves and tying the legs together with a stretcher, he moves on to dust collection, where diagonal nailers are installed to support the half-inch pre-finished Baltic birch plywood. To avoid sagging, he adds a support across the bottom before fitting and fastening the first pan. Then he runs through the same program on the other end, and combined, the 2 V-shaped pans will direct dust and debris away from center out towards each end, with the pre-finished surfaces helping the dust to move freely. To support the shelves, he fashions angled brackets that reach back onto the torsion box. In addition to supporting the shelves, They also help support the legs, as well as closing the open gap along the sides of the collection pans. Then he installs an inner leg. These add some bulk to the legs, but also act as nailers for the stretcher that unify the leg assembly into a solid system. Once tipped upright, Peter leaps up onto the table, using the weight of his 6-foot-plus frame to demonstrate its strength. Then he does the same with the shelving, and I was a little more than impressed. That shelf did not budge. Next up, he outfits both sides of the table with brackets for his track saw tracks. He installs them with individual blocks rather than a long strip of wood that would collect dust. These are aligned with every other cross member about every 12 inches. These are tacked and screwed in place, giving the assembly the strength to double as a solid shelf for clamping and planing. Then he constructs 2 simple dust collection boxes outfitted with casters. These are built with angled sides to tuck neatly under the shelving, where they capture the sawdust sliding its way off the collection trays. Finally, he installs a 4-foot power strip along one end, giving him the ability to keep multiple tools plugged in and at the ready while working. And here she is, the Polcyn Cut Table 2.0. Of course, when I arrived home, Peter had already sent me pictures as he'd modified the shelf by tucking a handy drawer underneath and cutting down the rolling box to accommodate it. I guess customizing and tweaking is a never-ending process. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out Peter's article in Fine Homebuilding's issue number 292.